Clint Eastwood spots a homeless mother in her car, her baby wrapped in mismatched blankets, struggling against the biting cold. Her exhaustion is undeniable, and the baby's faint cries pierce the silence of the empty parking lot. What Clint does next will not only change their lives forever, but will leave you absolutely speechless. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you love heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we have another special story just for you. Clint Eastwood had just wrapped up a long day on set. It was the kind of work that left him tired but satisfied, the way a man feels after putting in an honest day's effort. He liked to keep things simple, none of that Hollywood glitz when the cameras weren't rolling. So, on his way home, he pulled into a small supermarket looking to grab a few essentials. The night was cold, the kind that settled into your bones if you stood still too long. Clint pulled his coat a little tighter as he stepped out of his truck, his boots hitting the asphalt with a quiet thud. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a handful of cars scattered under the dim glow of the streetlights. That's when he saw it. Tucked in the farthest corner, half hidden in the shadows, was an old sedan that looked like it had been through hell. The paint was faded, rust creeping along the edges, and the windows were fogged from the inside. Clothes hung across the back seat like a makeshift closet, swaying slightly with the breeze. Near the car, a woman was pushing a row of shopping carts back toward the store. Her coat was too thin for a night like this, and even from a distance Clint could tell she was running on empty. She moved slow, like every step cost her more than she had to give. He'd seen people down on their luck before. Hell, he'd been around long enough to know life had a way of beating folks down. But something about this didn't sit right. As he turned toward his truck, a sound cut through the quiet. A baby's cry. He stopped. The woman froze too, her shoulders going stiff before she turned back toward the car. A second later, she yanked open the door and disappeared inside. The crying quieted, replaced by the low hum of her voice, soft and soothing. Clint exhaled slowly, his breath hanging in the cold air. He could have just gotten in his truck and driven off. Wasn't his business, wasn't his problem. But as he stood there, hands shoved in his pockets, he felt that old familiar pull in his gut, the kind that told him to pay attention. Some folks in this world just needed a little bit of help, and some folks, well, they needed a damn miracle. Either way, Clint wasn't the kind of man to look the other way. Clint couldn't shake it. He'd seen a lot in his time, more than most, but something about that woman and her baby stuck with him. As he drove home, the image gnawed at the back of his mind. The old car, the way she moved like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Sleep didn't come easy that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene over and over. Maybe it was the way she never looked up, like she was afraid to be seen. Maybe it was the baby's cry, small and fragile in the cold night air. Whatever it was, it sat heavy in his chest. By morning, he knew what he had to do. Without much thought, he climbed back into his truck and drove straight to that supermarket lot. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the pavement, but to his relief, the car was still there. The woman was moving around, carrying a small plastic bag, probably whatever she could afford to scrape together. She walked back toward the car, her steps slow, careful. Clint wasn't the kind of man to make a fuss. He knew people had their pride, and sometimes a direct offer of help felt like a handout. That wasn't what he wanted this to be. So instead, he did it quiet. He walked over, set a bottle of water and a thick, brand new blanket on the hood of her car, then turned and headed back to his truck. No words, no grand gestures, just something small, something useful. From inside his truck, he watched as she opened her car door, then froze. Her eyes flickered around, scanning the lot like she was expecting a trick. A long beat passed before she reached out and picked up the blanket, running her fingers over the fabric. Then the water. She stood there for a moment, staring down at the items in her hands. He couldn't hear her, but he saw the way her lips moved, whispering something. Maybe it was just to herself. Maybe it was a prayer. Either way, Clint understood. It wasn't much, but it was something. And sometimes, something was all a person needed to keep going. By the third day, Clint knew he wasn't just going to walk away. Some folks might have thought it was none of their business, but he wasn't built like that. Life had a way of knocking people down, and sometimes all a person needed was for someone to notice. So he returned to that parking lot, same as before. The morning air was crisp, the sun barely warming the cracked pavement. He spotted the car right away. Still there, still her only refuge. He waited, not wanting to startle her. After a while, she emerged from the driver's seat, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, dark circles under her eyes. She moved with the careful hesitation of someone who had spent too long looking over her shoulder. Clint took a slow step forward. "Hi," he said, keeping his voice easy. No sudden movements, no pressure. She stiffened instantly, her fingers tightening around the plastic bag she carried. Her eyes darted toward him, sharp and guarded. "I'm the guy who left the water and the blanket yesterday," he continued, his tone even, calm. "I hope you didn't feel uncomfortable." She didn't answer right away, just studied him, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke. Why?" A simple word, but one that carried so much weight. A question not just for him, but for the world, for all the times life had taken more than it gave. Clint shrugged, his hands resting in his jacket pockets. "Saw you here. Thought you might need 'em. That's all." He didn't push, didn't prod for details she wasn't ready to give. Trust wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned. For a long moment, she just looked at him. The suspicion was still there, but it wasn't as sharp now. Finally, she nodded, a small, hesitant movement. Then, almost too soft to hear, she whispered, "Thank you." It wasn't much, but it was something. By the third day, Clint had made up his mind. He wasn't the kind of man to meddle in other people's business, but he also wasn't the kind to ignore something that sat heavy on his conscience. And this woman, this baby, this was something he couldn't shake. So, he went back. The morning was colder than the last, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones if you weren't prepared for it. Clint pulled his coat tighter as he walked across the lot, his boots scuffing against the pavement. The old car was still there, parked in the same spot, its windows fogged up from the cold. He waited. No sudden moves, no forcing anything. After a while, the woman stepped out, a plastic bag clutched in her hands. She moved like someone who was used to making herself small, like the world had taught her that blending in was the safest way to survive. Clint took a slow step forward and cleared his throat. "Hi." She froze. Her grip on the bag tightened, her shoulders stiffened, and her gaze snapped toward him, sharp, wary, like a cornered animal ready to run if she had to. He raised his hands slightly, palms open. "I'm the guy who left the water and the blanket yesterday," he said, keeping his voice steady but gentle. "Hope that didn't make you uncomfortable." Her eyes narrowed, flicking over him, measuring, assessing. Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, she spoke. Why?" That single word carried the weight of something deeper than simple curiosity. It was suspicion, exhaustion, and years of being let down all tangled together. Clint shifted on his feet, choosing his words carefully. "Saw you here. Figured you could use them. That's all." He didn't offer anything more, didn't push. People who'd been through hard times didn't trust easy. They'd been promised too much and given too little. He understood that. The woman didn't move, but something in her posture softened just a fraction. A long pause. Then, barely above a whisper, she murmured, "Thank you." It wasn't much, but it was enough. Clint was about to step away, figuring he'd given the woman enough space for now. But then, from inside the car, a sound stopped him in his tracks. A small, fragile cry, barely cutting through the cold night air. The woman spun around fast, yanking the car door open. She moved with the kind of urgency only a mother understands, her body tense as she reached inside. Clint hesitated, watching as she shifted around in the cramped space. A few seconds later, she pulled out a bundled-up baby, no more than a few months old. She cradled the child against her chest, swaying slightly, murmuring soft words he couldn't hear. Something twisted deep in Clint's gut. He'd seen hard times, knew what struggle looked like, but there was something about a mother and her baby living out of a car that hit different. He took a step closer, careful not to spook her. "You need anything?" His voice was rougher than he intended, so he softened it. "Formula? Diapers?" The woman froze mid-rock. For a long moment, she didn't look at him. Clint could see the war raging inside her. He knew that look well, the battle between pride and necessity. She didn't want to take a handout, but hunger and exhaustion didn't leave much room for stubbornness. Finally, so quiet he almost missed it, she whispered, I need milk." That was all Clint needed to hear. Without another word, he turned and walked straight into the supermarket. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he made his way through the aisles. He grabbed a few cans of baby formula, a pack of diapers, and some wipes. On a second thought, he added a small stuffed bear to the basket. The cashier looked up as he placed the items on the belt, raising an eyebrow at the unlikely sight of Clint Eastwood buying baby supplies. He just gave a nod, paid in cash, and headed back out. When he returned to the car, the woman was still standing there, the baby quiet against her chest. Her arms were wrapped around the small body like a shield. Clint held out the bag. "Here." Her hands trembled as she reached for it. For a second, she just stared at the items inside, her fingers brushing over the containers of formula like they were the most precious things in the world. Then, she swallowed hard and said, "Thank you." 2 words, but Clint heard everything she wasn't saying. The exhaustion, the desperation, the relief. He gave her a small nod. "No problem." She didn't cry. She didn't break down. But when she turned back to her car, her grip on that bag was tight, like she was holding on to hope itself. Clint knew handing out a few supplies wasn't enough. A warm meal, a safe place to sleep. Those were just Band-Aids. What Emily needed was something solid, something lasting. That night, he made some calls. He'd worked with a community center before, a place that specialized in helping folks down on their luck. They'd helped veterans, single mothers, people who just needed a damn break. He explained Emily's situation and, by morning, had arranged temporary housing, financial assistance, and a shot at steady work for her. When Clint pulled up to the parking lot, Emily was already awake, sitting on the curb with Oliver tucked against her chest. She looked up as he approached, her expression guarded as always. "Got something for you," Clint said, handing her a folded piece of paper. She took it cautiously, smoothing it out with shaking hands. When she read the words, a housing voucher, an address, a name to ask for, her breath hitched. "This is a place?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A roof over your head, a real bed for the kid," Clint said. "They'll help you get on your feet. No strings attached." Emily looked from the paper to Clint, then back down at Oliver. He was sleeping, his tiny fingers curled around a piece of her shirt. When she spoke again, her voice cracked. "I don't know how to thank you." Clint shifted, uncomfortable with the weight of gratitude in her eyes. He wasn't looking for thanks. He just wanted to know she'd be okay. "You don't have to," he said simply. "Just focus on getting back on your feet." Emily nodded, holding the paper like it was her lifeline. For the first time since he'd met her, Clint saw something in her eyes besides exhaustion. Hope. The days passed, then weeks. Little by little, Emily started to rebuild her life, not just survive, but actually live. At first, it was the small things. Sleeping through the night without worrying about someone banging on her car window, waking up to Oliver's soft breathing instead of the bitter morning chill. The community center helped her secure temporary childcare, and before long she found a part-time job waiting tables at a small diner on the edge of town. It wasn't glamorous, and the pay wasn't much, but it was honest work. More importantly, it was hers. She earned every dollar, every tired step at the end of a shift, and for the first time in years, she had something resembling stability. Clint checked in from time to time, never hovering, never making her feel like a charity case. He'd just show up, maybe with a coffee or a small bag of groceries, and sit with her outside the community center. He never pried into her past, never asked for details she wasn't ready to share. He was just there, steady as a rock, a presence she hadn't realized she needed. One afternoon, as the autumn air carried the faint scent of burning leaves, Emily sat across from Clint on a weathered wooden bench. Oliver was nestled in her lap, his tiny fingers wrapped around a cracker, gnawing at it absent-mindedly. She hesitated before speaking, staring down at her hands, fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "I let Oliver's grandparents visit him today." Clint didn't react right away. He just watched her, waiting, the way he always did. Emily exhaled sharply. "I was scared," she admitted. "I didn't know how they'd react, or if they'd even want to see him. But I had to do it." For Oliver, Clint finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "That's a brave choice." Emily let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "I don't feel brave. I feel like I'm barely holding it together." Clint shrugged, taking a sip from the coffee in his hand. "Doesn't mean you ain't. Being brave ain't about not being scared. It's about doing the right thing even when you are." She looked at him then, really looked at him. There was something about Clint, something unshakable, something that made her believe, just for a moment, that maybe she could do this. Maybe she could claw her way back to something more. She glanced down at Oliver, who was now babbling softly to himself, completely unaware of the world's weight on his mother's shoulders. I want him to have a shot at a normal life, you know?" Emily said, voice barely above a whisper. Clint nodded. "And you're giving him that." For the first time in a long while, Emily felt something unfamiliar, something light, something warm. Emily's story isn't just about fate or chance, it's about the extraordinary power of human kindness. A single moment, a simple act, can change the course of a life forever. Clint Eastwood didn't have to stop. He didn't have to listen. But he did. Not because there were cameras, not because he wanted recognition, simply because he had a heart big enough to see past the surface. In that moment, he didn't see a stranger. He saw a human being in need. Today, Emily no longer wakes up in a car. She wakes up in a home, with a purpose, with a future she never thought possible. Because one person decided to stop and help. Let this be a reminder. Kindness has the power to rewrite stories. If this touched your heart, share it. Because somewhere out there, someone else needs to believe in the goodness of people. And don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow, we have another story that will move you just as much.